I'm Clara Ellis, 32, and I built a career defending national security in ways most people never see. For years, I showed up for my country, my team, and a father who never once acknowledged it. But when he told our family I was dead to him for choosing a different path than his, I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been written off by someone you sacrificed everything for? If so, drop your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being dismissed, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about drawing the line and owning your worth. Because what happened next, you won't believe. My name is Clara Ellis, and for most of my childhood, I thought I was born to serve. Not in some abstract, patriotic sense, I mean literally serve. Orders, inspections, codes of conduct. My father made sure of it. Colonel Rick Ellis, U.S. Army, third-generation infantry, lifelong enforcer of rules and silence. To the outside world, he was a decorated warfighter. To me, he was the standard I was supposed to measure up to. And I tried. God, did I try. We lived on or near military bases for most of my life. Fort Carson, Fort Bragg, a brief stint overseas in Germany when I was 6. Wherever we were stationed, the rhythm stayed the same. Up at 0500, beds made with hospital corners, shoes polished, shirts tucked. Even as a little kid, I was expected to keep pace. At 7, I could recite the Army values backward. At 9, I could break down a field rucksack blindfolded. Respect wasn't earned in our house, it was demanded. And love? That was implied, like heat from a closed oven. You assumed it was there, even if you never felt it directly. Still, I craved his approval. In every way that mattered, I was my father's shadow. I'd sit cross-legged on the carpet while he cleaned his rifle, watching his hands with reverence. He never smiled when I asked questions, but he answered them, and in our world, that counted as connection. I wore his old drill cap around the house like a crown. I used to trace the outline of his medals in his shadow box when he wasn't looking. I'd sneak into his study to read the citation letters on his wall. I wanted to be the kind of person who earned those words. By middle school, I was already training like I was headed to basic. Push-ups, long runs, cold showers. I volunteered for JROTC as soon as I was eligible. Woke up at 5:30 every day to train before classes, even when my friends begged me to sleep in. It didn't matter. If I got one nod of approval from my dad, it was worth it. And sometimes I did small, subtle things. A clipped good work when he saw my inspection sheet. A quiet that's how it's done after I aced a field test. That was the currency I chased for years. But I also had other interests. Ones that didn't fit neatly into my father's rigid worldview. In high school, I joined the coding club. At first, it was just a way to log some extracurriculars for West Point, but I got hooked. I started designing basic encryption tools, tinkering with open-source software, eventually diving into cybersecurity challenges. My math teacher pulled me aside one afternoon after class and said, "Clara, you have a brain for systems. You ever consider national security work?" I laughed. "You mean like NSA?" He smiled. "Or beyond." I applied to the Army Cyber Operations program first, mostly to stay on the path my father could understand, but I also applied to a civilian track scholarship for public interest cybersecurity with a federal agency. When I got the acceptance letter for the scholarship, my hands shook. Full ride, high-level mentorship, guaranteed placement in a federal task force postgrad. It was everything I wanted: purpose, service, and impact, just not the way my father imagined it. When I showed him the letter, he barely looked up from his coffee. "So you're not taking the ROTC route?" he asked flatly. I told him no, that I wanted to serve, but in a different way. That cyber threats were the new battlefield. That policy and tech weren't the enemy, they were the front line. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just gave a short, stiff nod and walked out of the room. I told myself it was fine. He was just processing. He needed time. But weeks passed and nothing changed. He stopped asking about my classes. He avoided my office when I came home on breaks. He never mentioned the scholarship again. I tried not to take it personally. He was old school, and this was new territory. Still, I sent him updates from training. I mailed home a photo of me in my federal agency ID badge. My mom framed it and put it on the mantle. He never commented. Despite the distance, I still tried to show up for him. I drove my mom to every VA appointment when he refused to go. I sent care packages to his old unit's new recruits when they deployed, just to keep his traditions alive. When his back started acting up again, and he wouldn't admit he needed help, I quietly arranged a home PT consult through a friend in the system. He never thanked me, but he let them in. That was enough. I even visited his old base before my first major deployment. Took photos of the memorial wall he helped design. Left a note under the plaque with his name on it. "Still trying to make you proud," I wrote. No signature. Just a simple sentence I knew he'd recognize if he ever saw it. For a while, I held on to the belief that maybe, one day, he'd understand. That he'd see what I was doing wasn't a rejection of his path, it was an evolution of it. That fighting for your country didn't have to involve a rifle or a uniform with his name stitched above the heart. That maybe, just maybe, there was more than one way to serve with honor. But that understanding never came. At least, not then. The deeper I went into the work, real, messy, high-stakes missions, the more I realized just how far apart we'd drifted. And yet, I still made time. Still tried to bridge the gap. Called on his birthday. Sent photos from the field. Asked for advice on leadership, even when I knew I wouldn't get much in return. I did it because that's what daughters do when they're raised in duty-bound homes. You keep showing up, even when the door stays half shut. And when people asked me about him, I kept it simple. He served 23 years. I learned everything I know about discipline from him. I never mentioned the silence. Never brought up the fact that he hadn't visited me once since I started my program. That he hadn't asked a single question about the unit I'd helped build from the ground up. I protected his legacy, even when it meant diminishing my own. To the world, we were still the perfect military family. Stoic. Loyal. Metal-heavy and polished. The kind that took photos in front of flagpoles and showed up at Veterans Day parades with matching jackets. And I let that story stand. Because the truth, the quiet disappointment, the unspoken disapproval, wasn't something I was ready to confront. Not yet. But that's where the story really begins. Because eventually, the truth has a way of surfacing. Even in families like mine. Especially in families like mine. And when it did, it didn't come through a confrontation. It came through a statue. A stage. And a cord my father pulled with his own hand. But that's getting ahead of things. Before that moment, before his stunned silence and the world seeing what he refused to, there was still a lot more to lose. And a lot more to prove. During my second year in the program, I landed a coveted internship with a federal agency that specialized in cybersecurity strategy. It wasn't the Department of Defense, which I knew was already a mark against me in my father's eyes, but it was real work. Mission-driven, high clearance, meaningful outcomes. My unit was small but sharp, a mix of coders, analysts, and former field operatives who now translated battlefield lessons into digital protocols. We weren't on the ground, but we were often the first to spot the breach, the last to leave the server room, and sometimes the only line of defense when a nation-state actor tried to worm its way into infrastructure systems. I remember the day I got the offer call, sitting in the back hallway of my university's computer science building, phone pressed to my ear, knees bouncing. When I hung up, I called my mom first. She was thrilled. Told me she'd make a roast when I came home next. I texted my dad second. The message was short, just got the DHS rotation. Cyber Strategy Unit. Starts June 1st. He replied 3 hours later. Congrats. So, desk work? No question mark. Just a flat observation dressed up as a question. I sent back a laughing emoji, tried to play it off. He never replied. The first real crack in the wall came that Thanksgiving. I'd been working 10-hour shifts with the incident response team in DC. Our unit helped intercept a ransomware attack targeting U.S. energy grids. The kind of threat that, if successful, could have shut down hospitals and airports in 6 states. I flew home the morning after the takedown. Still had briefing notes in my carry-on. At dinner, my aunt asked what I was working on. I gave a short version, no details, just a general outline. Our team flagged a foreign probe on some utility networks. We coordinated the response with 3 agencies. It was a good week. Before I could finish, my dad cut in from across the table. Let me know when someone hands you a rifle in a blackout zone. Then we'll talk about pressure. The room went quiet. My uncle laughed nervously and changed the subject. I stayed silent. It wasn't the first time he'd made a comment like that, but it was the first time it stung in public. After that, the pattern got harder to ignore. He stopped introducing me as my daughter in national security. Instead, it became, she works with tech stuff. Government adjacent. Once, at a family barbecue, I overheard him telling my cousin's husband I was off in some liberal think tank, as if I were sitting in coffee shops debating theory instead of running breach simulations for live threats. I tried to shrug it off. Told myself he just didn't understand the work. That maybe if he saw it in action, he'd get it. But the truth was, he didn't want to. Not really. Because if he acknowledged what I did as service, then he'd have to make room for a version of honor that didn't look like his. When my brother tried to enlist the following spring, my dad was ecstatic. Jake had never been particularly disciplined. He coasted through high school, bounced between temp jobs, and had a habit of quitting when things got hard. But the second he walked into a recruiting office, Dad lit up. Drove him to every appointment. Bought him boots. Started using phrases like, finally a real man in the family. I didn't say anything. Not when Jake failed his physical the first time. Not when he missed the follow-up because he'd been out drinking the night before. Dad still called him the one who gets it. Said he just needed time to shape up. When Jake flunked out of boot camp after less than 6 weeks, Dad blamed the instructors. Said they didn't know how to handle someone with raw potential. He never mentioned my brother's lateness, his disciplinary write-ups, the failed PT scores. Just bureaucracy and rigged systems. That same month, I received a classified commendation from my agency for early detection in a coordinated phishing attack that had targeted several military contractor systems. I sent my mom a redacted copy. She said she'd frame it. My dad never brought it up. Then came his retirement ceremony. 23 years of service, 3 deployments, countless commendations. The base threw a full formal event. I flew in from DC on my own dime, took leave to make sure I didn't miss it. I even wore a blazer and heels, something I rarely did, just to make sure I looked presentable in the front row. The auditorium was packed. Officers, NCOs, family friends. A slideshow played of his career, younger versions of him in deserts and jungles, a few grainy family photos in between. My face was in one of them, a shot of me saluting him during a homecoming when I was 9. That was the last time I appeared on the screen. His speech was long but polished. He thanked his mentors, his COs, his squad mates. He mentioned his brother, who never served, but who once mailed him cigars during a deployment. He spoke of his wife, her strength, her loyalty. Then he talked about his children. My son Jake, he said, smiling, has the heart of a soldier. He's got that fire. That grit. I see myself in him. The crowd clapped. I kept my hands folded in my lap. He didn't mention me. Not once. Afterward, at the reception, a few people came up to congratulate him. Others congratulated Jake. You'll carry on the legacy, one man said, slapping my brother on the back. Make the Ellis proud. I stood 10 feet away, invisible in plain sight. One of my dad's former captains approached me near the punch table. You his daughter, he asked. I nodded. What do you do? I gave him the short version, Federal Cybersecurity Unit, critical infrastructure focus. His eyes widened. You serious? That stuff's frontline these days. I've seen the briefings. I smiled. Yeah, it's evolving. He shook his head. Wish more old-timers got that. Later, in the parking lot, my mom hugged me tight. Said she was proud of me, that she wished he knew how to say it out loud. I said I was fine. That I understood. But something shifted for me that day. Not because he forgot me, I think that would have hurt less. But because I realized he didn't forget. He chose not to include me. He could rewrite Jake's failure into potential. He could spin his own narrative however he wanted. But my story, the one where I wore a badge instead of a uniform, where I protected the country with firewalls instead of rifles, didn't fit the version of pride he knew how to carry. And from that moment on, I stopped waiting for him to. I didn't stop calling, didn't cut ties, but I started drawing quiet lines. Not out of spite, just self-preservation. Because I was beginning to understand that recognition wasn't coming. And if I kept chasing it, I'd never stop running. When I made lieutenant, I sent him a photo. It wasn't the kind of uniform he'd worn. It was the updated dress for our Joint Cyber Ops Advisory Unit, but it still carried the emblem, the flag, and the weight of everything I'd worked for. I stood beside my CO in the picture, clean lines, polished badge, the backdrop of an operations center visible behind me. I sent it without a caption. Just the photo. I figured the rank said enough. He replied the next morning with a single sentence, "You are no daughter of mine." I stared at the screen for a long time. At first, I thought maybe it was a mistake. A text meant for someone else. Or maybe a joke, cruel, sure, but his sense of humor had never been exactly gentle. I called. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. I tried again an hour later. Straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message either time. I didn't know what I would even say. Around 5 p.m., my mom texted. "It's best you don't bring this up again. He's upset." No further explanation. No mention of what he was upset about. Just a quiet instruction to drop it and move on. I didn't respond. The weeks that followed were a blur of mission planning and back-to-back briefings. I was working with a joint task force supporting infrastructure readiness on the East Coast. Long days, longer nights, but it was the kind of work I'd always wanted: real-time threat analysis, proactive defense models, hands-on collaboration with both civilian and military branches. My commanding officer had nominated me for a cross-agency leadership initiative. I was finally gaining traction in a space that mattered. And yet, in the quiet hours between assignments, that text sat lodged in the back of my brain like a splinter. Not because I believed it, but because I did. A month later, I was sitting in a diner just outside Quantico with my unit lead when my cousin Rachel sent me a screenshot. No context. Just the image. It was a Facebook post from my father. A photo of him, my brother Jake, and two of our younger cousins, all dressed in varying degrees of camo and khaki, standing in front of a military museum exhibit. The caption read, "Proud of these future leaders." The rest chose their own path. I stared at the image while my coffee went cold. Rachel followed up a minute later. "I'm sorry. I thought you should see it. If you want me to say something, I will." I typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on, "Don't. Just don't engage." There was nothing to defend. The message was clear. I'd already been erased. Quietly, deliberately, and in full view of anyone who might ask where I'd gone. It stopped being about approval after that. I wasn't trying to win anything anymore. I just wanted the truth of what was happening to be something I could hold in my hand, not some gaslit version where I was reading into things or being too sensitive. That screenshot said everything. The wedding came a few weeks later. A cousin on my mom's side, someone I hadn't seen in years, but the invitation had arrived addressed to both me and Jake. I debated skipping it altogether. My mom called 3 times that week, leaving voicemails about how it would mean a lot if I came. How everyone was asking about me. How she was sure things would calm down with time. I didn't believe her, but I went. It was one of those sprawling summer weddings, rented tent, string lights, country club setting. I arrived just after the ceremony started, kept my sunglasses on through most of it, and slid into the back row to avoid being noticed. My mother spotted me during the cocktail hour and waved me over with the kind of nervous smile that made it clear she wasn't sure whether to hug me or act like I was just another guest. My father was standing at the edge of the patio, drink in hand, deep in conversation with a retired colonel from his old unit. I hadn't seen him in person in over a year. His hair was thinner, his posture a little stiffer, but otherwise unchanged. He laughed at something the colonel said, clinked glasses, and turned to head inside. I stepped into his path. "Hi, Dad." He looked straight through me, walked past like I wasn't there. Not a flinch. Not a glance. Just air between us. I stood frozen for a second, unsure whether I'd imagined it. A nearby couple glanced my way, probably thinking I was just some awkward +1 trying to make small talk. I turned back toward the lawn and walked away before anyone else could see. Later that night, I was in line for a drink when I overheard him talking to a distant uncle near the bar. The music had gotten louder, but I caught the tail end of it as I passed behind them. "She's dead to me," he said. No anger in his voice. No heat. Just a calm, final certainty. Like it was a fact, not a wound. I left before the cake was cut. Didn't say goodbye to my mom. Didn't tell anyone I was going. I walked out through the valet entrance, ordered a rideshare, and sat in the back seat watching the venue shrink in the side mirror. My dress was still pressed, my makeup intact, but something else inside me had finally split. Not cracked. Not worn thin. Split. There wasn't going to be a turning point. No speech that made it better. No memory strong enough to undo what had been said and done. He'd made his choice. Drew a line. And for the first time, I stopped trying to erase it. When I got home, I packed every family photo off my shelf. Boxed up the medals and notes he'd given me over the years, old birthday cards, scribbled field notes from when I used to sneak into his study to play soldier. I didn't throw them out. I just didn't want to see them anymore. Not until I figured out what they meant to me without his voice attached. A week later, I submitted my application for extended deployment. Overseas rotation, new assignment, full separation from anything domestic. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, and no one asked. In some families, silence is the thing you fight to break. In mine, it's the thing you learn to live around, until it grows so loud, it finally drowns you. That night at the wedding, I stopped fighting. And that silence? I let it win. For a while. I deployed to Eastern Europe in early December. My official role was joint liaison to a multilateral task force working on cyber resilience protocols, but the job stretched far beyond keyboards and briefings. We rotated through a string of bases, some in Poland, some farther east, depending on threat assessments. Most weeks, we were up at 0500, asleep, if we were lucky, by midnight. Snow came early that year. I packed for function, not comfort, and within days my body adjusted to the cold, the hours, the pace. The stillness out there felt honest. Exhausting, yes. But at least it wasn't pretending to be something it wasn't. The work kept my mind occupied most of the time. I oversaw the digital integrity of allied systems, helped integrate protocols across partner agencies, and trained junior officers in breach simulation response. There was something grounding about the structure of it. Something familiar. No space for emotion. Just tasks, objectives, consequences. I didn't think about home much unless someone brought it up. When they did, I'd say, my parents are in the States. Retired Army dad. Still living near Fort Benning. I never explained beyond that. Late one night after a 14-hour shift, my CO handed me an envelope. The unit had just finished repelling a layered phishing campaign that had wormed its way through 2 allied contractor systems. We caught it in time, isolated it, documented it, and rebuilt the firewall. Quiet success. No press release. No ceremony. Just the job. Inside the envelope was a commendation letter, partially redacted, but clear enough. It cited exceptional response coordination under time-sensitive pressure and noted commendable leadership contributing to mission continuity across 3 allied operations centers. The praise came from the head of a NATO cyber directorate. I was supposed to feel something. Pride. Accomplishment. Validation. Instead, I thought, he'll never care. Not that I needed him to. But the thought still arrived uninvited. That night, I sat in the base canteen with Elena, one of the few officers I'd grown close to since arriving. She was Air Force, sharp-eyed, fast-talking, and unafraid to call things as she saw them. We'd pulled the same shifts all week and shared a mutual fondness for instant coffee and sarcasm. She noticed the envelope before I said anything. "What's that?" I slid it across the table. She read it twice. "Jesus. That's big." I shrugged. "It doesn't change much." She tilted her head, studying me. "You thinking about him again?" I didn't answer. She leaned back. "Clara, if he can't see you now, it's because he never saw you to begin with." It landed harder than I expected. Maybe because she said it so plainly. Or maybe because I'd started to believe it myself. Later that night, alone in my quarters, I sat on my cot and made myself remember all the ways I'd tried. All the flights home for birthdays, even when I could only stay 48 hours. The care packages I mailed to his old unit after he retired, out of respect, out of tradition. The photos I sent when I earned new clearances, earned my bars, ran point on missions I couldn't even fully describe out loud. The holiday calls. The quiet deference. The instinct to protect his reputation, even when he refused to acknowledge mine. I remembered the times I asked my mom what he'd said about me after something big, a promotion, a public commendation, and her carefully neutral replies. He's proud. In his way. He just doesn't know how to express it. He worries about you. I knew, even then, that she was trying to translate a silence too loud to ignore. But none of it was enough. Because I'd built my whole sense of worth on the idea that if I just worked hard enough, showed up enough, proved myself enough, he'd meet me in the middle. That the distance was temporary. That all I had to do was not give up. The thing no one tells you about people like him is that their love is conditional, not just on your success, but on the shape that success takes. I didn't realize I'd stepped outside that shape until I was already too far from shore. When I stopped trying to fix it, something strange happened. The grief stayed, but the guilt started to loosen its grip. I stopped editing myself when talking about my job. Stopped softening the language, trying to make it palatable for an audience who'd already decided not to listen. I stopped wondering if every new milestone would be the one that finally changed his mind. I didn't cut him off. That wasn't my style. But I started letting the silence stand. When my mom called, I kept the conversation short. I didn't ask for updates. When a family friend emailed to say she'd heard about my assignment and wanted to congratulate me, I thanked her and didn't ask how my dad was doing. When Jake sent a photo of them at a VFW fundraiser with a caption that read, "Ellis, still standing strong," I closed the message and didn't reply. It wasn't detachment. It was clarity. Elena and I spent Christmas Eve on standby. No parties, no decorations, just cheap coffee and briefings. Around 2300, she handed me a lumpy, poorly wrapped package with a smirk. Inside was a sweatshirt from her alma mater and a notebook with the phrase "You are not small" stamped on the cover. I raised an eyebrow. "You trying to convert me?" She laughed. "Nah, just making sure someone's reminding you." I didn't tell her, but I wore that sweatshirt every night for a week after that. Not because of what it meant, but because of who gave it to me, someone who saw me fully, without needing a translation. By January, we were rotating into a new region. My role expanded. I was briefing officers from 5 different countries, coordinating drills, building out a rapid response model that would end up being adapted across the task force. The work was demanding, but it felt earned. I'd stopped trying to prove anything. Now I was just doing what I knew how to do. Back home, my mom emailed twice in February. One message was about a neighbor who passed away. The other was a link to an article about a local high school scholarship. I didn't reply to either. Not out of malice. Just because there was nothing left to say. I heard through someone else, a friend of a friend, that my dad had started leaving me out of conversations entirely. Introduced Jake as his only kid at a reunion. Told someone I was off the grid now. Not lost. Not missed. Just deleted. And strangely, for the first time in a long time, that knowledge didn't hollow me out. It just confirmed what I already knew. The illusion was gone. But so was the weight of keeping it alive. By the time spring rolled around, I'd made my decision. Not with a speech or a dramatic send-off, just a quiet, firm shift. I stopped reaching out. No more holiday calls. No more texts on his birthday. I skipped the annual group thread my mom always sent out on Veterans Day with family photos and grainy throwbacks. I didn't tell them when I received the Defense Superior Service Medal. Didn't even mention it to my mother. She would have passed it along. I didn't want that anymore. When the medal arrived, I opened the box alone at my desk. Inside, a short citation, a serial number, the emblem. I closed the lid after 30 seconds. There was no one I needed to show it to. That same month, I was offered a position in DC, senior analyst, direct-to-agency pipeline, high visibility. It would have been a natural progression. Comfortable, influential, and close to home. But I declined. Instead, I accepted a transfer to a joint NATO cyberintelligence program operating out of Brussels and 2 rotating satellite bases. It was a full deployment. No easy flights home. No weekends off. No mailing address unless someone knew how to reach me through internal channels. I signed the paperwork without hesitation. The morning after I arrived at our first staging post, I received an email from my mother. Subject line, thinking of you. Inside, it said, he's confused why you're distant. He says he misses the old you. Just wanted you to know. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to hurt her. Just because I didn't have anything else to give. I stopped tracking birthdays, family events, reunions. The obligation faded slowly, like a muscle I'd stopped using. Eventually, it didn't hurt anymore. Just quieted into something manageable. Meanwhile, the work grew. My new unit was leaner, more specialized. We handled forward-facing operations, threat detection, counterintelligence, war games simulations. The tempo was higher. The stakes more immediate. I worked with allies who didn't care about my last name, only whether I could deliver. And I did. We exposed infiltration attempts, designed patch systems, trained foreign military tech teams on next-gen encryption standards. I spoke at closed-door conferences where half the attendees couldn't reveal their agency of origin. I started writing internal white papers on strategic escalation deterrence. By the end of my first year, my notes were being cited by policy analysts at Joint Command. Still, no press. No interviews. Everything I did happened under radar. But the impact was real. We had confirmation that our response protocols had prevented critical infrastructure failure in at least 3 allied nations. Lives were saved. Economies protected. Stability maintained. My name wasn't in the headlines. But it didn't have to be. That was never the point. Occasionally, someone back home would send a message through channels, a former mentor, an old peer. Just enough to remind me I hadn't disappeared entirely. But I kept my replies brief. Professional. Detached. My mother sent another email about 6 months after the first. Saw your name mentioned in a footnote of a NATO bulletin. Your father hasn't said anything. But he printed it out and put it in his desk drawer. I thought you should know. I didn't ask how she knew that. Didn't ask what it meant. If anything. By then, I'd learned how to stop translating his silences. That desk drawer could hold pride, or regret, or nothing at all. It didn't matter anymore. Then came the call. It was early autumn, just before we rotated into our second base. I was standing outside the main hub building, watching a convoy load equipment, when I noticed the incoming number. It was my old commander. Someone I hadn't heard from in over a year. A man who'd once taught me how to brief under fire and how to write a mission report that could pass through 6 filters without losing its meaning. Hey, Lieutenant, he said, even though I'd been promoted. Old habits. Got a second? We made small talk for a minute. Then he got to the point. You remember my old base? The one your father retired from? Yeah, I said. Fort Ames. They're doing a commemoration project. A statue. It's part of a new initiative, modern service members reshaping the battlefield. Their words, not mine. Cyberintelligence, asymmetrical warfare, all of it. I didn't say anything. He continued, I submitted your name. So did a few others. The board reviewed nominations. Unanimous vote. They chose you. I leaned against the concrete wall and looked out across the motor pool. For a moment, I didn't feel anything. They're planning the ceremony for next spring, he said. They'll handle logistics. Just wanted to let you know first. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. Thanks. After we hung up, I went back to work. I didn't mention the call to anyone. Not that day. Not that week. The information sat with me in the same way the metal had, real, but self-contained. It wasn't until weeks later, during a long night of systems analysis, that it hit me. That statue, it wouldn't just stand on any base. It would stand on his base. The place where he'd been celebrated, saluted, sent off with honors. The base where I'd sat in the front row during his retirement speech and listened to him name everyone but me. Now they were asking him to return as a guest of honor. To pull a cord. And see my face. in bronze, on his parade ground. I didn't know what his reaction would be. I didn't care, because for once, it wasn't about him. It was about the people who nominated me. The ones who'd seen what he wouldn't. The commanders who'd read my reports, the analysts who'd used my protocols, the allies who'd sent notes in languages I barely understood thanking me for what we'd helped prevent. It was about the soldier in Poland who told me, "We don't feel like the forgotten ones anymore." The young lieutenant in Estonia who cried when our simulation training showed her how to defend her unit's data without relying on foreign contractors. The quiet victories no one outside our world would ever hear about. It was about the legacy I was building. Not to prove anything. Not to earn anything. But because it mattered. The statue wasn't mine. Not really. It belonged to every quiet operator who'd ever been told their work wasn't real. Every specialist who fought in the shadows and got written out of the story. Every daughter whose version of service didn't look like the one her father believed in. They chose me. And this time, I wasn't going to explain it to anyone. I didn't say yes right away. I told them I'd think about it. When the base coordinator followed up 2 weeks later and confirmed who the guest of honor would be, I didn't even pretend to be surprised. My father. Of course they'd invited him. He was a known figure on that base. A former commander. Respected. Decorated. Safe. He was the face people still associated with tradition and grit and honor in its cleanest, most photogenic form. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that while they were planning the statue, he was still telling anyone who asked that I'd defected from the family. That I'd gone off course. That I'd picked a side and it wasn't his. I don't know what I expected, really. That he'd mellow with time? That the silence would become regret? It didn't. At least not publicly. The few times my name surfaced through mutual acquaintances, he corrected them. Told them I wasn't in the military. That I was doing private work or civilian consulting or playing at soldier. The wording shifted depending on who he was talking to. But the message stayed the same. He hadn't changed. Not even slightly. So when I found out he'd be the one unveiling the statue, I paused. Just for a second. Not because I needed revenge. And not because I wanted him to finally acknowledge what I'd done. I just wanted him to see it. To have to look at it. To stand there in front of all the people who still thought he was a hero and feel, if only for a second, the weight of everything he'd tried to erase. But they hadn't asked him to speak. That mattered. The invitation was ceremonial, not symbolic. He'd been brought in as a retired officer with legacy ties to the base. Nothing more. The speech would be handled by the current command team. He was there for one reason, to pull the cord. I told them they could move forward with the plan. I didn't tell my mother. By then, we only exchanged the occasional message. She still followed the base's social page, still quietly scrolled past press releases and recognition posts tagged with my unit's name. She never liked anything. Never commented. But I knew she saw them. That was her way of staying connected, watching without participating. I didn't send her the invite. The day of the ceremony came fast. Quietly. No media coverage. No press vans. Just the standard base photographer and a small podium with folding chairs in neat rows. The kind of event that felt intimate by design, but carried more weight than anyone admitted out loud. I arrived early, kept to the sidelines. I wasn't wearing my uniform. They'd given me the option, but I declined. I wasn't there as a figure to be saluted. I was there as a fact to be reckoned with. I wore a plain suit and stayed out of view until the last minute. The guest area filled slowly. Uniformed officers, enlisted men and women, spouses, kids. The kind of crowd that knew how to stand still for 30 minutes without checking a phone. I spotted some familiar faces, one of my former instructors, a liaison I'd worked with in Estonia, even a visiting commander from my current station. They nodded when they saw me. Respectful. Low-key. Then he arrived. My father stepped out of a government SUV wearing full dress uniform. Polished shoes. Ribbon chest. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but dimensionally. Like the myth had finally shrunk down to fit the man. He stood beside the base commander at center stage, right next to the covered statue. They handed him a program. He didn't glance at it. Just stood there, hands behind his back, jaw set in that familiar way, the one he used whenever he felt the world owed him its attention. The ceremony started with a short speech. The base commander welcomed everyone, acknowledged the service members in attendance, thanked families for their support. Then he spoke about modern warfare, how threats had evolved, how the battlefield wasn't always physical anymore. Sometimes, he said, the fight happened in code, in data streams, in silences no one heard until they cracked open a system or collapsed a grid. He talked about hybrid threats, about resilience, about the soldiers who worked in the shadows so others didn't have to. Today, he said, we honor one of those quiet defenders. Then he turned to my father. Colonel Ellis, would you do the honors? I watched from the second row, partially obscured by a group of junior officers. My father stepped forward. Someone handed him the cord. He didn't say a word, just reached out, grabbed the rope, and pulled. The cloth slipped away cleanly. No wind, no delay, and there I was, cast in bronze, standing tall, in uniform, not the one he'd worn, but a formal version of mine. No helmet, no weapon, just a calm expression, gaze forward, posture straight. At the base, a small plaque. To those who defend without recognition. The silence that followed was subtle, but real. No gasp, no applause, just stillness. The kind of stillness where people recalibrate what they thought they knew. My father stared at the statue. He didn't move, didn't speak. His jaw didn't twitch. His hands didn't adjust. He just looked. Long enough that the base commander gently thanked him and signaled the next speaker forward. As he stepped back, I saw his eyes flick across the audience. Scanning, maybe. Searching for something. When he reached my row, our eyes met. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who'd been handed a version of history he couldn't rewrite. I held his gaze for half a second, then looked away. Not out of defiance, just because the moment had passed. He took his seat. The next speech began. A lieutenant colonel from an allied unit gave a brief talk about modern service, digital integrity, and unseen heroes. I barely heard it. Afterward, there were photos. Casual congratulations. Quiet nods from people who didn't need to say more. My father didn't approach me. He stayed in the background, shaking hands with old colleagues. Talking. Smiling. Playing his role. But I noticed one thing. When the event ended and the crowd thinned, he walked back to the statue alone. He stood in front of it for a long time. He didn't touch it. Didn't kneel. Didn't even pretend to pray. But he stayed. Just looking. I didn't interrupt. Because that wasn't my moment. It was his. And for once, there was no one left to perform for. When the curtain fell and the statue came into full view, he didn't flinch. Didn't adjust his stance. Didn't look around to see who was watching. He just stared straight ahead, like he was reading something in a language he'd never bothered to learn. The sculpture wasn't meant to provoke. No raised weapon. No battlefield backdrop. Just me, standing in uniform, arms at my sides, expression clear but not confrontational. It had been modeled from a photo my unit submitted, one taken after a multi-nation exercise last year. In it, I'd been listening to a translator speak, the kind of focused, still moment most people would scroll past. That was the version of me they chose to carve in bronze. The inscription was simple. To those who defend without recognition, thank you. He blinked once. Looked down at the plaque. Looked back up. For a second, his mouth opened like he might say something. But no sound came. He just stepped back. Nodded once. And that was it. No speech. No commentary. Just a single movement, barely visible if you weren't paying attention. After the ceremony, the crowd broke apart quickly. The families drifted toward their cars. Officers headed back to the admin buildings. Some lingered for photos. A few posed with the statue, but most just looked. Quietly. I stayed behind for a few minutes, chatting with the base commander and 2 members of the selection committee. Kept it polite brief. I declined the offer to attend the private reception. Said I had a flight. By the time I passed through the rear gate and walked toward the lot, the sun had started to sink. And there he was. Alone. Standing in front of the statue. Still, he hadn't followed the crowd, hadn't joined the reception. Just stood, hands behind his back, weight on his heels, eyes fixed on the same spot. I watched from a distance. Not hiding, but not intruding either. I didn't owe him that moment. And I didn't want it. I just needed to see it for myself. Needed to know that he had to stand there, surrounded by people he once led, and face the one truth he'd refused to say out loud, that I existed. That I served. That I'd done it all without his blessing, and still ended up on his base, cast in metal. I left without speaking to him. A week later, my mom sent a one-line email. No greeting. No punctuation. He keeps reading articles about you. I didn't reply. I wasn't sure if it was meant to be a peace offering or a warning. Probably both. Still, the emails kept coming. Quiet, infrequent. Nothing dramatic. She sent a photo of a box on his desk, the one she'd said he kept in the drawer. It was open now. Inside were a few clippings. A copy of the NATO commendation. A printed version of an internal bulletin with my name at the bottom. Nothing I'd sent him. Nothing he'd ever acknowledged. A month after that, she called. I didn't pick up. She left a voicemail. Said she understood if I didn't want contact, but that he'd started asking questions. About my work. About my postings. About whether I was safe. I still didn't reply. Because I wasn't sure what he wanted: information, redemption, or absolution. And I wasn't prepared to offer any of those things. But slowly, the silence changed shape. It wasn't bitter anymore. Just neutral. Lighter. Like I no longer had to protect myself from being misunderstood. 3 months later, I received a letter. Not an email. Not a message relayed through someone else. A physical letter. Neatly typed. No return address, but the tone gave him away. He didn't apologize. Not directly. But he acknowledged the statue. Said it was unexpected. That it had made him think. He referenced the plaque inscription, said he'd stood there longer than was probably normal, trying to figure out why it felt familiar. Said he realized later it was the kind of phrasing I used in my old letters home from college. He remembered that, he said. My voice in those notes. He didn't ask to meet. Didn't ask for anything at all. He just said, if you ever feel like it, I'm here. I didn't write back. Not right away. But I kept the letter. Later that year, I ran into a former contact from his old unit. Retired now, working in civilian defense consulting. He asked how I was doing, then said, you know, your dad doesn't talk much. But he keeps your photo in his wallet. I didn't ask which one. Didn't need to. It took another 6 months before I agreed to speak with him. A short call. Supervised. In a way, I was at a conference and surrounded by colleagues, so the timing felt safe. He kept the conversation factual. Asked about the unit, about my rotation schedule. Didn't offer any opinions. Just listened. That was new. Near the end, he said something I didn't expect. You know, I used to think honor looked one way. Turns out I just wasn't looking hard enough. I didn't thank him. Didn't tell him it meant anything. Just said, okay. And that was enough. We don't talk often. It's not a repair. Not really. Just contact. I've set the terms. When he emails now, I read it. Sometimes I reply. Sometimes I don't. He doesn't press. He's learning. And I'm not waiting anymore for approval or recognition or some perfect version of the story to tie everything up cleanly. That's not how it works. But there's something else I've come to understand. Even fractured things can settle. Even silence can shift. And sometimes, the smallest nod is the loudest truth a person like him can give. So I take it. On my terms. And I move forward. It's been almost a year. I've moved stations twice since the ceremony. First to a joint command center overseeing EUCOM response protocols, and now to a quieter strategic advisory role based out of Italy. My days are still long, but they're measured differently now. Fewer briefings, more planning. Less triage, more foresight. I work with people who know exactly what I've done, but don't treat me like a symbol. Just a peer. A capable one. And that's all I've ever wanted. I don't think about the statue every day. But sometimes, it finds me. Someone will tag me in a post from the base. A school group doing a tour. A young girl in uniform slacks, standing next to the sculpture with her arms folded the same way mine are. No hashtags. No commentary. Just quiet pride. A teacher once messaged me directly. She asked if she could wear her cousin's old RODC pin for the photo. Said she wants to be the kind that helps, like her. I read that message twice. Then I closed my laptop and went for a walk. It's strange, the moments that land. They're rarely the loud ones. More often it's the echoes, the unprompted proof that what you built continues to hold shape, even when you're not standing next to it. My mother emails occasionally. She doesn't mention my father anymore. Just short updates about the neighborhood, a new doctor she's seeing, recipes she thinks I'd like. I answer maybe 1 out of 3. I'm not being cold. I'm just being honest about what I have to give. As for him, we haven't spoken since that call. No new letters. No messages. Nothing from his end, and I haven't reached out either. I'm not angry. I'm not even waiting. We simply exist on parallel tracks now. Not intersecting. But not hostile either. Some part of me knows he still checks in though. Quietly. Indirectly. Probably reads articles. Maybe keeps tabs through the base bulletin, or by asking mutuals questions he pretends are casual. That's fine. That's his way. And in the end, it doesn't change what's true. The statue wasn't about him. Not really. It never was. It was about making space for someone like me, for women who don't fit the legacy, but still carry it forward. For service that doesn't scream, but sustains. For the ones who've been told that real heroes look a certain way, speak a certain way, fight a certain way, and who do the job anyway, without waiting for permission. It's there for every girl who walks that base and wonders if she belongs. For every parent who thinks they know what pride should look like. For every soldier who's ever felt unseen just because their work didn't fit someone else's narrative of valor. I think he saw that in the end. That day on the stage, when the cloth dropped and my face looked back at him. I don't think he saw the daughter he disowned. I think he saw the soldier he never believed I could become. And he couldn't take it back. He couldn't deny it. Couldn't talk over it. Couldn't shape the moment to fit the version of history he preferred. Because it was already cast in metal. Already visible. Already permanent. That's the thing about legacy, it doesn't wait for consensus. It moves forward with or without approval. And sometimes justice comes quietly. Not with a confrontation. Not with applause. Not with the satisfaction of being proven right. But with a simple reveal. A single nod. And a silence that finally says everything. So no, we may never speak again. He may never apologize. He may never say the words out loud that I once begged to hear. But I don't need that anymore. Because what I built stands. Not just on that pedestal, but in the people I've trained. The allies I've supported. The systems I've protected. The girls who take photos next to the bronze version of me and walk away believing that maybe, just maybe, they could do it too. That's the legacy now. And that's more than enough. Thanks for watching. Have you ever had to earn respect from someone who never believed in you? Or had your success recognized only after it was too big to ignore? Drop your story in the comments. I want to hear how you stood your ground. And if you've ever been underestimated, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a reminder. Your legacy doesn't need permission.